Welcome everyone to the first Bristol Academic Lecture Series for fall 2019. My name is Brian McGuire. I've recently taken over this role as the Teaching and Learning Fellow from Rosario. So bear with me here, speaking in front of crowds, even of this size. It's not my strong point in microphones. But I think this is an excellent start to this semester. This is a time where we are being challenged to take a fresh look at what it is that we do in this community in general and in the classrooms. And for faculty, this is a very exciting time as we seem to be getting the structural kind of administrative support that we need to do different things in the classroom and different ways of delivering, such as theme-based class learning communities, experiential learning. So this is it's an exciting time, and it's a great start to the academic lecture series to have Professor Michael Geary talk to us about his theme-based work. Just a brief mention about Mike. Mike Geary is the Associate Professor of English, Writing Center Coordinator, and Vice President of the Faculty and Professional Staff Senate at Bristol Community College. He's also the former chair of the English Department's Portfolio Assessment Project. Now in his 20th academic year in higher ed, Mike has been experimenting with thematic-based courses since 2004. He has presented at conferences on college composition and communication 7 times, served on the 2015 CCC Technical and Scientific Communication Awards Selection Committee, and served a 4-year term as a policy analyst for the NCTE's Policy Analysis Initiative, representing the state of Rhode Island. He is currently the co-chair of the Environmental Rhetoric and Advocacy SIG? Special Interest Group. See, learning things all the time. Special Interest Group, and it's awesome to learn it in the moment in front of people. This is my favorite way to learn. His article, Writing About Wolves, Using Eco-Composition Pedagogy to Teach Social Justice and Theme-Based Composition course, was published this past summer in the Journal of the Assemble for Expanded Perspectives of Learning. He has also finished the first draft of his first novel, The Lone Wolf Chronicles, which tells the story of a young wolf who goes on an epic journey to prove that he is worthy enough to become the leader of his pack. And before I step on any more lines, I present Michael Geary. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Brian. Everyone can hear me okay, right? All right, awesome, because me and these microphones have been having a very good relationship. Sometimes I sound like I'm eating them, so if I do that and there's a big like boom or something like that, I apologize. Like I say, Mike and Mike don't always completely jive together. So I'm excited to be here to talk about a class that's been very passionate to me, one I started back in 2013. And I was thinking about, as I was thinking about this presentation today, I was trying to kind of think about the way that I would actually go about sort of putting it together. You know, how much I dabble with theory, how much did I storytell, and I wanted to kind of do sort of a combination of those things. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to tell some stories. I'm going to talk a little bit about the pedagogy. I'm going to talk a little bit about the theory, but I'm not going to go into the theory in so much detail because I want you all to find my article and read it, where I go into it in a lot more detail. But also just the opportunity to be able to share this experience with you for a big risk that I took in terms of designing curriculum and having it go for as long as it did during my time here. So this retrospective, again, 5 years. I'm not currently teaching this class this semester. I'm taking a little bit of a break from it. But I want to start off by asking all of you folks a question. And my question is simply this. Have you had an encounter with a wolf in the past year? Oh, think about that for a moment. Have you had any kind of an encounter with a wolf in the past year?
Metaphorically speaking.
In any way? No? Maybe one of you? How many of you have seen this commercial? Okay. Okay, you've had an encounter with a wolf. Really the way we define an encounter with a particular subject is through any medium. It could be textual, it could be visual, it could be like, hey, there's a wolf in my backyard. Granted, that does not happen in Massachusetts, but anytime you have an encounter on any level, it influences your perspective on that particular subject. So for example, like this one, like I love Grandpa Wolf, This medication in particular helps with breathing, and of course, there is using the idea of blowing down the little pig's house they probably would prefer that his asthma kicked in and that he would not be able to go ahead and blow down. But what's interesting is that the commercial itself, it gives you a variety of perspectives about wolves. On the one hand, he's a little family man. He's playing with his grandson, and you see these family get-togethers. I think there's even a part where he's blowing out candles on a birthday cake. Yet then you have this scene, right, which draws upon the well-established Three Little Pigs storyline, where, as well, he has this medication, and now he can basically go terrorize the little pigs and eat them up. So you get two distinct impressions. One of them that's partially true with the way wolf packs actually structure, and then the other sort of the popular mythology that goes along with it. So whether it's in film, whether it's a story, whether it's a documentary, whether it's a commercial, you probably have had some kind of an encounter with wolves. And understanding that what is an encounter is kind of important, understanding where we start off with writing about wolves itself. So this class for me, it didn't actually start in 2013. It actually started for me back in 1986 when I had my first real encounter with a wolf in this film. Anyone seen it? The Journey of Natty Gann. If you haven't seen it, I know what you're probably going to want to go watch this weekend. Let me tell you a little bit about it. The film is set during the 1930s, during the Great Depression. Natty's father, he basically works for a lumbering company, and he is forced to move west to go ahead and find work, and she's left behind with an abusive nanny. Well, Natty says she's had enough, and she runs away from the abusive nanny, and she goes in search of her father. Along the way, close to the midpoint of the film, she comes upon a dog fighting ring, and one of the dogs in there is actually a wolf. And he's depicted as being sort of this vicious animal that's going to lash out and is going to kill all these other dogs and all this other business. And then the fight doesn't turn in the wolf's favor, and Natty feels great sympathy for him, and she winds up freeing him. And the wolf is very, very loyal. Well, the wolf literally follows her across country as she's going to try to find her father. Like, they ride the rails together. The wolf is hopping on the train with her. They're having all of these connections, right? He almost becomes a domesticated dog for her. Near the end of the film, the wolf hears other wolves in the wild, and it's torn. Do I go to it, or do I stay with Natty? And the Natty, realizing, hey, that's probably the wolf's family, she tells it to go. And it does, but not before looking back for verification that, hey, it's okay for me to go along. And then the wolf ultimately turns and runs off. I think that's the end of the wolf. Well, I'm going to give you a spoiler alert here. It's a Disney film from the 80s, so unless you're old yeller, you're going to know that the film winds up having a happy ending that goes along with it. Natty finds her father. But before they fade to the closing credits, father and daughter, they hug in the middle of the wilderness. Camera pans up, who's watching them? The wolf has been following her the entire time, making sure she's okay, that nothing's going to attack her in the wild. And then fade out, one more embrace with the father and the daughter. And I thought to myself, wow, what a very interesting depiction of a wolf. And even though I'd heard Three Little Pigs and Little Red Riding Hood and all those stories before, this really sat with me for a while, this image of the wolf. And then as we moved into the early 90s, I got a little bit more interested in the wolf because wolf merchandise started showing up everywhere. By that point, it's on the endangered species list. Emerald Square Mall opens, and two of my favorite stores were there at the time. Those of you going back a little bit, if you remember Solitudes and Natural Wonders, both of them were environmental-themed stores that sold their fair share of wolf merchandise. And as part of that, one thing they were doing was you can sponsor an animal that's on the endangered species. So guess what Mike did? I sponsored a wolf. And that's my wolf. That is Motzi. He was a member of the Sawtooth Pack, and this was an early initiative to try to reintroduce wolves in the wild in the Sawtooth Mountains of Idaho. So for, I think it was like $25 a year, I was helping the wolf actually get food and be able to sustain itself. And it was an early opportunity to reintroduce wolves in the wild. Prior to that, it had been many decades since a wolf had actually wandered through the woods in the mountains in Idaho, due to the fact that it was believed that wolves were a horrible predator. And, you know, we actually live in wolf country. You may not realize it, but wolves were exterminated from the entire area of New England early in the 20th century because it was believed that through mythology, all the stories that wolves are going to come and devour you, that this was a creature that needed to be completely eradicated. In fact, there were bounties. The President of the United States at the time, I believe it was Eisenhower, he authorized the killing of wolves in mass numbers so that by the time you got through the 1950s, you only had less than 100 wolves, where there had previously been thousands of them. So it was a mass extermination of a species over fear. And that kind of led me to really be concerned about the wolf conservation movement. And since around 1992 or so, when I actually started sponsoring MOTSE, I've been following the wolf wars in the West. And even though it's far from home, certainly it's something that it resonates with me. And it winds up influencing the class, as I'll talk about in just a moment. So fast forward into my experience with theme-based classes, and they actually started fairly early on. My first semester at Bristol was in 2000, and in 2004, I dabbled with my first opportunity with that. It was actually a learning community with then accounting professor Carol Garand. So it was paired with her Accounting 101 class and CSS 101, and at the time, the way the learning communities worked, that they were supposed to remain enrolled in all of the courses, and that we would compare notes, and we would collaborate in a way that the curriculum would kind of overlap but not be identical. So it went well, and then I kind of walked away from it for a while because Carol and I got busy doing other things, and we never reinvigorated it. But then 2009 is when I really started kind of moving forward again with this idea of theme-based courses. A course we do have in the catalog but doesn't currently run is Critical Writing and Academic Research. I resurrected that using Legends, Lies, and Lore, with the idea of exploring mythology such as ghost hunting, psychics, paranormal phenomena, UFOs, etc., and the students loved it. Like, I even had students who were doing ghost hunting out in the woods. I think it was Freetown State Forest. Someone did a ghost hunt and wrote a paper about it. So they had a great time, and then the class just didn't get enrollment, and it kind of fell away. But in 2012, the English department was asked by business to resurrect some sort of theme-based class involving business. So my background, not everyone realizes I actually spent three semesters as a business major. So business has always sort of been a piece of who I am, and I wound up minoring in economics to go along with that. So here comes business. And then 2013 is when I've wound up launching Writing About Wolves. And the numbers that are next to each of the classes, that's how many semesters the class actually ran. So you can see wolves ran the most number of times. Monsters is a close second, and then business winds up coming in third. The zombie apocalypse is going to start kind of catching up there, as I think I'm going to be doing that every semester going forward. But certainly the various themes over the years have kind of taught me a lot about the way classes are supposed to be structured. And every one of these is different in some way in terms of the way that the theme winds up being accessed. But why writing about wolves? That's like one of the early ones that I did. Well, what was going on at the time when I said, hey, let's do this crazy class? So let's talk a little bit about the birth from it. So at this point, I was actually 3 years into writing my novel. And one of the things that I said that I initially started out doing with that is I wanted to be about wolf men versus wolves. But then as I started drafting it, I was like, no, I really want this to be about wolves. And you know what? I'm going to channel Richard Adams, well-known author, wrote Watership Down, which was an epic story about rabbits. So I'm like, why don't I just do this about wolves? So I'm going to do a lot of research into the biology of wolves and read about what a lot of scientists have said about the way wolves behave and such. So I did that. And as I was doing that, I came across a lot of issues that I had with what was going on with wolf conservation. The fact that there were people running around with bumper stickers saying smoke a pack a day, and they weren't talking about cigarettes. They were talking about gunning down a pack of wolves out west. I was like, ouch. Right? So there was a lot of rhetoric that I saw in the wolf wars. And I'm like, wow, this is a debatable issue. Pro-wolf, anti-wolf. There's a reason we can structure a class around argumentation with that. The other thing, I said I was dissatisfied with writing about business. And it wasn't because the class was going badly. In fact, my students were enjoying the class. I had high retention numbers for the class, but it also wasn't hitting its target, right? It was intended for business majors, and I wound up getting a lot of future nurses in the class, which, I mean, I'm sure they thought it was interesting to learn about insider trading, but it wasn't going to help them out when they were actually working in the hospital. So it wasn't quite hitting its mark. But the other thing, too, is that the structure of it, it wasn't necessarily coherent together. There were units. Like, here is one assignment, new unit, new topic. Another unit, another new topic. So the assignments didn't really fit in together. And I was thinking that in order for this to really be a theme-based class, it has to go somewhere, right? It has to have a certain trajectory. And I wasn't finding that with business. But with wolves, it occurred to me, hey, there's a way that this can happen because of this idea of myth-making, right? The idea that because of the way that wolves are perceived in literature and stories and whatever you have and what have you, people believe certain things about them. And then as a result of that, they reacted. And what was the result of that? Well, their extermination almost in the continental United States. And I also looked at this for purposes of allegory, that if that's true about one population, if there are myths about one population, and this is what happens, could we notice a similar structure that's happening with other populations across the country? So when I came up with writing about wolves, first I'll kind of dovetail into this idea of best practices with themes. One of the things that you do when you select a theme is that it has to have breadth and relevance, right? So certainly you have to be able to do something more with it. It can't just be, well, here's a wolf. What do you think of the wolf here? It has to go in a particular direction. It also has to be aware of student demographics, right? Particularly at a college like this where each campus has sort of different demographics and you need to be able to speak to them in a variety of ways. You have to frame the whole structure of the class. You have to have a specific purpose in mind, a direction that you're going to wind up going in. And the challenge is to capture their interest, right? And again, people come to the table with very, very different ideas, and you may not be easy to sway them over. And also, course outcomes matter. And one of the things that really has helped me with every single one of the theme-based classes that I've taught is it being involved in the English department's portfolio assessment project, right? Because that forces me to be honest about what the outcomes of the class are and the way that I shape those assignments so that no matter how fun the topic is, it has to meet the outcomes of the class. And my checks and balances, I'm going to have 2 faculty members of the English department, they're going to read this writing against it. So I can't just do what I want. It has to conform to the course outcomes. The theme-based courses allow for the multiple point of view, and the most important thing, if this is done in a comp class, the focus has to be on the writing. That's what the class is about. It's not about lecturing about the theme. So in this class, there are no lectures about wolves. That's not the case, right? It's all done through critical reading and critical writing. So the structure of it, there are really 3 units of the class. I've labeled them the 3 Fs, fiction, fact, fallout, and they begin by having students understand their relationship with the theme. So right away, we're talking about their encounter with the theme, whatever that winds up being. And we'll talk about maybe a fairy tale that they've heard, maybe seeing a wolf at a zoo. What was it that got you on board with your understanding of what a wolf is and what a wolf is all about? And then we build from there, right? If that's their base knowledge, now everything we do after that builds upon it. So in the fiction unit, if you're familiar with a couple of those fairy tales, let's read a few more. Let's read some Native American ones. Let's read some Russian ones. Let's read some Chinese ones. And let's see if we can paint a larger picture about what these wolves are actually like as depicted in what I'll call the mythology. And how does that influence and shape your perception of these individuals? And the critical reading piece is essential because once we move out of that, then we move into literary nonfiction. And then beyond that, we move into documentaries and then academic research to kind of wrap the class up. The assignments also relate to each other. They rely on building of knowledge. So your base understanding, here's where a wolf is. Now let's see what happens when some of those beliefs are put to the test. When people actually go and encounter wolves in the wild, how are those claims refuted? How are they reinforced? When we talk about credibility of sources, the more time that you wind up reading the same ideas, to what extent does that build credibility? Does that allow you to believe that certain ideas may wind up being true? And ultimately, the goal is to get them into talking about wolf conservation, which is where we wind up ending the course. So that's the assignment lineup altogether. So the first couple of years, I did a definition essay, and basically that was how does world literature define wolves? And used some stories that we had read to kind of shape that. But then I started thinking about this idea of the importance of getting their individual encounters to come to the table. So that's where I changed it to an illustration essay. How do your experiences with wolves influence your perception of them? And it could be anything, the zoo, stories, whatever the case might be. Draw upon what we read, draw upon what you had read previously. Then go to traditional rhetorical analysis, where we look at the structure of an argument, we look at the way that ideas relate to each other in a text. Primarily, I use Folly-Morit's Never Cry Wolf, which is a text that some argue is actually a work of fiction, and he contends is a work of fact. And then there's a debate that goes on about that. It comes up in the other units of the course. Followed by a comparison essay. The version I use of that now is they read a scientific article about wolf behavior, and then we watch a documentary, and we talk about how knowing what the science says, to what extent does that make you trust the credibility of a documentary that's been geared for a popular audience. And then the final piece, it winds up being a letter to a governor in New England, state of their choice, to either advocate for or talk against a wolf conservation effort in that particular state, based on everything that they've learned about what wolves need in terms of food, water, geography, economics, all of that, how all that will wind up impacting. And throughout the semester, they've read various pieces that wind up talking about all of those issues. So they then synthesize all that information, do their academic research, and bring it together in a final piece. Then they do a final portfolio. As I mentioned, the course is part of the portfolio assessment. I used to have them do a cover letter. The last time I taught the class, I had to jettison the cover letter for reasons that I'll get to when I talk about why the class is currently on hiatus. Related to this as well is something called eco-composition. All right, and just want to keep my eye on the clock here. I was going to read an excerpt of my article dealing with eco-composition, but I'll just kind of give an overview of it just for the sake of time here. Basically, what eco-composition says is that one of the most important things in regards to understanding the way that students come at ideas is understanding how their environment impacts them. Now, eco-composition in its earliest days was kind of shoehorned around environmental issues. Of course, because when people think environment, they automatically think the natural world. But eco-composition isn't talking about that. They're talking about also the suburban neighborhood, right? The urban neighborhood. And the way that that experience, living in that environment, influences the way people not only express themselves, but the conclusions that they draw about certain subjects. And a true eco-composition course interrogates that. It encourages students to interrogate that. And it could be anything, as it suggests, geography, their history, their economics, their culture, experiencing that, seeing how that winds up happening. And it could also be the idea of having an awareness of how being in a certain space itself influences the way that you write. So, for example, the way that you express yourself in a classroom when you're writing in class, how is that experience different than if you were writing, let's say, out in the park, versus writing in a different room, a large auditorium like this, versus writing in your bedroom at home, and understanding that your ability to express yourself can be directly influenced by your surroundings. So, for me, this was the starting point with writing about wolves, that idea of culture, that cultural connection of how it influences the way that they think about their ideas and the way that they express their ideas. But an umbrella piece under that kind of aligns with why writing about wolves, the sort of the social justice metaphor that I talk about in my article, is the fact that eco-composition suggests that the relationship that nature has and the oppression that nature often endures is a parallel with the way that women are treated in society as a whole. So this idea of ecofeminism is sort of related to eco-composition as well. And out of that, we can draw an analogy that the way that we treat nature is the way that we would treat women, is the way that we would treat other populations as well that would be considered minorities, so that all of these things are kind of related to one another in some way. And the guiding text for this, if you're interested in reading about it, is this piece, Natural Discourse Toward Eco-Composition by Sidney Dobrin and Christian Weiser. I find that their reading here was really, really influential in both my article and also in the structure of the class. They kind of make sense a little bit more of that theory and really kind of spell it out in a lot of detail, that environmentalism, cultural studies, feminism, eco-criticism, all of that's all related to one another in some way. And that partially influences the way writing about wolves is put together. One thing I won't say about the class, my class is not a straight eco-composition class. Because to really spell that out in the way that Dobrin and Weiser do, it really needs to be like a writing studies department philosophy, that this is the way we're going to do our composition classes. Just one 15-week semester, you can get at some aspects of it, some ideas behind it, but you're not able to really kind of get into it in as much detail as needed. You just don't have the time with the students to be able to kind of run through all of that. And one of the things that happened, it was in my first semester of teaching this class, because I had it in my head, okay, if we can understand how myths about wolves lead to people hating them, which leads to people wanting to destroy them, which then we realized that we needed to do a mea culpa and then bring them back into the wild. If we can understand that, then we can understand why that happens with any other population. This was an idea in my head. And then while I'm teaching this in the first semester, this image comes across a Facebook page for a sportsman hunting group. Now look at the image for a moment. This speaks directly to the rhetoric behind writing about wolves. On so many levels, there's so many different things. You look at the American flag, there's something patriotic that's happening here. What's happening here? Well, there's the extermination of the wolf. Look, we're holding it. Look at our faces, they're covered up. We're not going to show you who they actually are. You know, I show this image to my students, and what do you think is the first thing that probably pops in their head? Yep. Ku Klux Klan. Exactly, exactly. So the image kind of sells the idea of this is a social justice metaphor. Can you understand that what you see happening here can happen to any individual population that is fundamentally misunderstood for whatever reason? Now, writing about wolves doesn't get that far to really explore other populations. It's about understanding the structures of society that lead to that. And if students can then take and transfer that over, they have that opportunity to transfer it over, then they'll appreciate more what's really going on in the country now, in a lot of respects. So what have my students thought of all of this? Well, I went to a very reliable place where I know a lot of my students go to. I went to ratemyprofessor.com, and look what somebody said. And then I went to another very reliable place, my Facebook feed, and one of my former students said that. She loved taking the class, this one particular student. It was actually her second time taking English 101. She hated it the first time. She said this was the best class that she ever took. Gave her confidence in her writing, relationship between ideas. I wish that happened all of the time. But this is obviously a big risk to use this particular curriculum because of the fact that the Wolf Wars is a long way away from anything that people can relate to in Massachusetts. So, other people noticed too. But the last semester I was teaching the class, there were a variety of things that were not going well with it, and I'll come back to that piece and with some final thoughts. But I was also spent a year actually writing this article. And again, there's an opportunity that came that presented itself to me from the Conference on College Composition and Communications. And for me, this provided validation. You know, I wondered in some semesters when the students disappeared, like, am I nuts for doing this? I hear folks and faculty and colleagues and friends all the time tell me I would love to take that class, and there are students who had taken the class and they would disappear. It's like, well, why? And sometimes it was like, I'd hear students say, I want to write about what I already know. I don't want to learn anything more. So I was like, I'm bored with the theme. And that's going to happen. It's one of the challenges you face with theme-based classes. But for me, having this article published, this provided a lot of validation for the work that I was doing, and kind of gives me the confidence as well to kind of go forward well with the class in a future semester. Let's talk a little bit about some lessons that I learned from this. All right, first of all, student buy-in is essential. And by buy-in, they also have to show up. The class rises and falls on whether or not they actually do the scaffolding, they do the reading, they do the assignments, they do the reflection, they come to class. If they don't do that, no matter what, the class won't be successful. It can't be. Right? Students have to find a way to be interested, and the challenge of teaching it is to give them that mechanism to actually be interested. Texts have to speak to and against each other, and I think that's important in a theme-based class. It has to be shown that the theme is worthy of debate, that there are multiple perspectives that can and should be considered in regards to that. It should be scaffolded so there's accumulated knowledge. so that where you are, each reading assignment builds upon the knowledge base that you already have, so that by the end you've accumulated a lot of knowledge, not through lecture, through critical reading and critical writing. Because again, it's a writing class, so the focus has to be on the writing. Reference librarian's awesome. Plain and simple. From the beginning of the class, I worked very, very closely with Emily Brown. She developed some amazing resources for my students. We were collaborating very closely on using a synthesis matrix in the last couple of semesters, integrating that through the assignments. The librarians would use it when they come to talk about their research, the research component of the class. Just they were the amazing resource to have. I can't say enough good things about the enthusiasm that the librarians brought to this class every single time that I taught it. Risk-taking is valuable, but wolf conservation is very passionate to me. And it's a huge risk. I mean, students can literally puncture a hole in your heart if you invest your heart in the class and they don't show up or they don't do the work. But it's a big risk. But it's a risk that I took over 8 semesters. And that experience was very, very rewarding. I'm glad I took that risk. And you need to change it up often. The assignments mostly stayed the same, but there was some variation on them across each of the semesters, particularly after my first sabbatical. When I had done a lot of research on theme-based courses, I revamped a lot of the assignments and changed out some of the readings. And the thing that I do want to emphasize, some big piece I learned about this, no matter how sound the pedagogy is, like I can go in, I can reference articles that everything that I'm doing matches up perfectly. It's no guarantee you're going to retain the students. You can invest all of that hard work, but there are some factors that are just outside of your control. And the last semester that I taught the class, factors that are outside of my control, when you have a clique of 3 friends who enroll in the class and one of them leaves and they all leave. Can't do anything about it. When you have students who come to class without a pen, paper, book, laptop, haven't done the reading, what do? Nothing you could do. When the same students don't show up every week, what do? You email them, they don't reply. Or when you have something strange like a student who lives in Attleboro registers for a class in New Bedford, it's at 8 o'clock on a Friday morning, is it any surprise why she might wander out of the class? So even you have all that pedagogy, sometimes that's just not going to be enough. But, and this is the important lesson I've learned as I've reflected back on it, it's not a reflection on you. It's not a reflection on your curriculum. It's just the luck of the draw with that one particular class. So take a breather, get up and try it again, right? Because when you've done it enough times, you know it works. And when you see the results, you know that students are up for this particular challenge. So what next? What's the next thing that Geary is going to do with this class? Well, right now I'm taking a break from it, but the big thing that I want to try to do is try to duplicate the structure with another theme. It's great to do it once. Yeah, I did it with wolves, but can I do it with something else? I have a couple of ideas for what some other themes are that I might wind up trying. Also, recently you have kind of floated through my email. There's a book actually on eco-composition theory. They're looking for articles about ways that assignments can be used using eco-composition pedagogy. So I might be starting a second article on this course, potentially for a book article publication. In the process of identifying some new texts, particularly there's a lot of new nonfiction texts about wolves that have come out within the last 5 years. So potentially doing something a little bit more modern than Never Cry Wolf. And I'm also trying to move away from essays, because one thing that's true about composition classes is that composition theory is changing. Right, they're doing a lot of very interesting things. There are some colleges where they're video gaming and talking about rhetorical strategies and writing papers about it. That's the homework. Go video game online. Write about the strategies. Why did you do certain things? I think that's awesome. I just wish I was a gamer and I could pull something like that off. But from what I've heard of presentations, it's working well. So why am I stuck doing essays all of the time? In fact, I'm trying out some new things this semester in my monsters theme class that I'm teaching, just different ways of giving students more than essays. Oh, and they've complained about that I Rate My Professor. All he does is assign these essays. So give him something else to complain about, I Rate My Professor. The other thing is too, it's a couple of years away, but I'm thinking about my next sabbatical project, and I'm thinking about doing something related to eco-composition. Again, I don't have a firm vision for what that'll look like. That's sort of the next strategy, and what I learned from that would be applied to the next generation of writing about wolves. And I wanted it to be exactly 40 minutes, and voila, leaves us plenty of time for questions. Don't be shy.
Can you give a couple of examples of assignments other than essays that you've given?
Sure. One thing that I'm doing this semester is I'm having my students do an annotated bibliography. But it's actually kind of modeled in the way the Criminal Justice Department does their annotated bibliography, where they have to create an introduction and then a question that they want to have explored. They examine it through a couple of sources, and then they arrive at a particular conclusion. The other thing I've experimented with is a photo essay, where they actually have to practice embedding images in their writing and embedding them in such a way that it winds up being part of the actual reading of the text itself. With that, I'm thinking about actually changing the mode in which they write it. I'm not doing that this semester, but I'm thinking about actually having them write it in PowerPoint and create sort of a multimodal film where perhaps they could add in audio if they wanted to, rather than it being in traditional essay format, where they're just taking a picture and popping it in instead of popping a quote in. And again, that's sort of part of the trend in composition theory, where they're really kind of looking to do some things like that. I think those are sort of my two main ones that I'm really looking at. But I'm willing to kind of look at other approaches as well. I think if I can do one new something each semester, then it'll wind up overhauling the class over a period of time. Yeah.
Have you ever found that your love and passion for wolves has taken you to a place where you start to teach about wolves more than teaching about writing? Like, is that something that you're aware of in the classroom? Like, oh, we're talking a lot about wolves now, we have to bring it back to writing. Is that something that you concern yourself with, or is it like, no, that's fine if we go off and talk a lot about wolves, because it's always going to come back to the thinking that's going to be reflected in the writing?
No, that's a great question. That's one of the challenges, because it's easy to go off on a little bit of a tangent at some point and fill in some details. One of the things that I do when I set up my classes is they tend to be very, very structured. So there's some sort of some series of tasks that wind up happening. So maybe we start with a reflection on a reading that they might have done. What ideas did you have? Okay, now let's do a group activity. So I put them in a group, and then they do a group response, and then they might do a reflection at the end. So one way that I kind of prevent that is I prevent myself from becoming the lecturer. Right? I put the work out on the students, and I have them do something with the material, because again, it increases that ownership of, wow, I actually have to do the reading, because when we come to class, we're going to get doing this group activity, and I don't want to be in a group where nobody's done the reading, because then I'm going to look bad, and we're all going to look bad. So it creates sort of this community ownership, right? And I mix it up. So they're never quite sure what it is that I'm going to do. So I try not to be too predictable, unless it is if there are like 6 options and there are 6 groups. Okay, group 1, you're doing option 1. Group 6, you're doing option 6. But otherwise, the nature of the activities and the nature of the questions winds up changing. And it's also based on the idea of accumulated knowledge. So what may be sort of basic understanding of a text next time may be about rhetorical appeals the next time around. So again, there's that scaffolding that goes in place with the activities. Have I gone off on tangents? Yep. Sometimes students enjoy it, because they'll be able to kind of draw upon something that they've read as well. But there's always that intent to kind of detour back. And I haven't done too badly. But I wish my writing about wolf students would kind of verify that for me.
Mike.
Yeah.
I have a question. One thing that has always been a concern of mine with the theme-based course is like the idea of topic fatigue of some sort. Like, so for instance, when it's not theme-based, there's always that moment when you're switching the assignment, and I'm just like, thank God we're done talking about that. Like, they weren't digging it, I'm not digging it, like, great, and now it's like turn the page. So that's always a concern. Like, I'd be thinking about, like, if I'm teaching a class like this, what are we, week 6? And if we're reaching that point, like, how many more weeks left of this? You know, like, so I'm gonna assume one of the, like, I'd ask, like, well, how do you tackle that? Like, that idea of, is that a problem, right? I know it's going to be a concern with some students, and is that one of the reasons why you're starting to think not just about the composition theory, but is that one way you can address that by having different kinds of assignments that circle around the theme?
I think so. One of the things about writing about wolves is that it's accumulated knowledge, but it's not like, okay, more wolves, and we look at rhetorical strategies. So when we get done looking at the fiction, and we look at Never Cry Wolf, we're like, oh, well, this is a controversial text. Let's look at controversy. What is controversy? Let's look at counter-argument. So it looks specifically at sort of rhetorical approaches, rhetorical appeals, etc., and it's less about what the content is. So when we do the comparison piece, yeah, there's contents about wolves, but we're looking at here's how you structure a comparison. And we change the genre around whether looking at a film and writing about a film versus reading a text. So I think mixing up the type of text as well winds up being helpful. I do think that fatigue with this subject winds up being a little bit of an issue. And that's where I kind of need to go back to the drawing board a little bit. I like to think that maybe changing the assignments around will probably help. But the only way I'll know is to actually go ahead and test that out. But I think one of the things that is important to do very early on is identify the need to study the subject. And if the students see, oh, there's a need or a value in this, then be it wolves, be it food, be it sustainability, be it global warming, climate change, whatever the case may wind up being, there's definitely a way that it could wind up working. And it needs to reach the right audience. And my classes are all tagged. It says writing about wolves. Tech writing says zombie apocalypse. So folks kind of should know what they're getting into if they see the tag on the registration screen, which they may not always, because they're usually looking for days and times, or if it's the last class that's open, they're all going to sign up for it. It's the luck of the draw that way. But I think one big thing with the theme base is having more of a marketing strategy. Like I feel like writing about wolf sustainability students, they'd probably be on board with it. Folks who are interested in liberal arts and sciences, particularly the math science option or biology transfer, life science, students who are in those programs might be a little bit more invested in it if they have that interest in biology. It's just a matter of kind of connecting that audience with the course itself without them being so preoccupied, days and times as being the main motivating factor. Yes?
Would you expand a little bit about the component of social justice in terms of what some student has perceived from their work? Have you found something about this social justice in terms of their argument?
Well, I think that's an opportunity I have with the class because I can teach that by inference. Like we talk about it early in the semester, is that can you understand how this is a metaphor for the big picture of what's going on with populations that are discriminated against. But in the course itself, I have yet to actually be able to kind of go back and do sort of a final assessment as to whether or not they've actually picked up on that and how it could be applied. And I think part of the reason for that is just I run out of time. It's a 15-week semester, and that's sort of like my secondary goal with the class is that social justice metaphor, with the primary one being conservation efforts and why they matter and environmentalism. So I feel like that's a challenge. And as I'm sort of letting the class simmer over the next couple of years or so, that's one thing I'm going to try and come back on, because maybe the final assessment is not, hey, let's support a wolf conservation effort. Maybe that final assignment should probably be, now that you've learned about myth making, can you think about another population that's similarly subjected to myth and what the consequences have been, and then do research on that. So I think there's a way of getting there. It's like, how do I trim the class so that it can be done, and how do I make it manageable for the students? Because I feel like that particular task requires more than a couple of weeks in order for them to be able to get to it. And 15 weeks fills up way too fast. I feel like there should be like a part 2, like sort of a next step. So folks who go through this, now let's kind of talk about these other social justice issues, but getting the same students to do both of them back to back, and also trying to kind of align that in a way with the composition sequence where the next one's writing about literature. It's not completely a good match to be able to actually do that. But that's an important piece of it. I think, like I say, the inference is there, and just finding ways to kind of talk about it again when there's so many other issues that come up in the class. Yeah, Rosario.
I was just wondering if you can talk a little bit about the aspects that you have found to be positive. For example, what students bring to the image of wolves that are I'm thinking a lot of times I hear, oh, the image of a wolf being the leader, or of their fears, or some things that can be positive instead of, predator.
Well, one of the things that surprised me is that a lot of students already have a positive view of wolves. Like, they don't think, oh, three little pigs, and they take it at face value. That's not that's not something that they've necessarily sort of bought into, but they've thought of it as sort of being this a rather beautiful creature, and a lot of them come to the table kind of understanding that their dog at home is a descendant, that they're biologically similar. So I think in that sense, they kind of look sort of positively at the creature. I think one of the things, just kind of dovetail off of that a little bit, in terms of like a positive thing I think the students take away from it, the critical writing that I get where the students are engaged is phenomenal. Like, it's amazing. Where I've seen students who have been barely able to scratch ideas together at the beginning of a semester, and at the end of the semester, they are submitting one of their essays to the Denning contest, and they're placing in the top 3. So, I mean, it shows that if they're really invested, if they see that there is an issue, they can come on board and they will apply themselves. They'll be interested, they'll be motivated to get the work done. It's just a matter of finding that spark. You're welcome.
I was just going to ask you, Mike, is there a difference in your retention between your Wolf class and your other one?
It depends on the semester. There was one semester where I was actually teaching 4 different versions of English 101. And there's a reason why I do that. Folks are like, oh, all that prep work. Yeah, but I have all the assignments prepped. It's just a matter of pulling them out of the assignment drawer. My reason for it is because I don't really want to go home and read 60 responses to the same prompt. I did that for a while. And there was a great assignment that I used before I was doing the theme-based, which was come up with a proposal to stop plagiarism in colleges and universities. Then there was one semester I did that across 4 sections of English 101. Let me tell you, I was ready to die. Yeah, when you're trying to read that in December, and then after a while you start thinking, well, they all wrote the same paper and just changed a couple of words around because all the ideas sound the same. I was like, I can't do this anymore. Now, and I know a number of my colleagues, they'll go home and they'll read like umpteen responses to one assignment. It's like, more power to you. I can't. I'd rather do one section of a theme a semester. This way I have something to look forward to, right? Different topic, like Brian, like you were saying, right? Sort of, okay, so this assignment, this particular section, it's all a hot mess and we all need to talk about revising it. Okay, we're done with that assignment. Let's look at a different class, a different assignment now, right? So certainly it gives that break for it and allows me to kind of focus a little bit more on that specific class and the needs of that class. But there was one semester when all my retention, I had an online version. I think I was doing wolves, business, and monsters all in one semester. They were all about the same in terms of retention, which just kind of told me, it's like, well, it doesn't really matter what I do, right? The same number of students are either going to do the work or not do the work. But then there's some semesters where it does not work. The last semester I did it, it did not work. It was embarrassing. It was heartbreaking. And actually, after that semester, I was like, I'm never doing this class again. Then my article got published. I'm like, someone thinks this makes sense. Maybe I should try it again. Let's take a little break from it. And I did it for 5 years straight. So it's time to kind of let it simmer, and then you can come back to it with a creative approach. Because the way I think about all my classes is, it's the learning writing process. It's applying the writing process, just like my students do. You draft it, you hope it works, you get feedback, and then you tweak it afterwards. And sometimes just letting even your best written document sit for a while, then come back to it, you realize, hey, it's time to tear that apart, try something else. Rethink it, redo it. So class structure is a lot like the assignments each one of my students do. Yeah.
After your article was published, have you taught the class?
No, the article was just published this past summer.
So it's,
And so the last time I taught it was last fall.
So it's an incentive for you to teach the class again and introduce your article to the students.
Well, potentially, if I want to go that route, be like, oh, look, I wrote an article on this. But also, yeah, I think I've learned a bit more about eco-composition as a result of researching the article. So trying to work in some more of those elements to the course, once you kind of digest it, because it's all, the theory itself is kind of a lot to kind of take in. And just the way I presented it to you, just kind of scratching at the surface of it. But if there's a way to kind of better infuse that into the nature of the class itself, then I'm certainly going to be interested in doing that. And like I say too, can I do it again? It's great to say, hey, I can do this once, but can I take an entirely different theme and have a similar structure in place? Yeah, that shows that a process winds up working when you can duplicate it and come up with some slightly different products.
You mentioned earlier the learning community with business. Is this something you would think about? Right? I mean, to me, like theme-based classes, they just scream for like learning communities. Like, and I see a class about wolves, I think about all the different places it could go, but all the different partnerships across disciplines. Is that something that you would think about returning to as you did at the very beginning of your exploration of theme?
I would definitely be open to it. Particularly if it was the idea of sort of exploring like a new theme, as it might relate. I'm not all opposed to going back to the business one. I enjoyed it. My students enjoyed it. I think I got actually some of my highest retention numbers out of that. You know, all the future nurses writing about business. It worked. They enjoyed it. I don't know. But just even kind of rethinking it, because it's been, I think 2014 was the last time I taught the business class. So again, that's had about a 5-year break. So looking at it with fresh eyes, fresh text, thinking about the class differently, probably would be a good thing. So I mean, I would definitely be open to it.
Good.
One other thing I do have for you folks, if you're interested, I do have a bibliography and works cited for the presentation itself. So this includes on it every article, every source that I used in my article, plus almost all the readings that I've used in writing about wolves at some time or another. So if you're interested, I'll have these up here for you if you just want to grab one on the way out.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you.